Thank you for joining Literally Alive. My name is Robert Diamante, and usually I introduce the guest who will be reading. But so I can join in on the reading and be a guest tonight, I am going to hand over the honor of hosting to Cara Douglas and Erin O'Mara, co-editors of Alive to This, Essays on Living Fully by 20 Maine Writers. Erin and Cara, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Robert.
Absolutely. And we also have Emma Krosschell with us, who will be reading from her wonderful book, Hermitage. And now I'm passing it over to you two.
Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
We will also mention as we get started here that because we're recording on a stormy night, there's a chance that some of us might lose power in the midst of everything that's happening. So if that happens, then directions will be forthcoming if we get truncated partway through.
Cara, can we acknowledge some of the readers who aren't joining us, but who might be in the chat tonight?
Yes. So I see that Carl Little has joined, and he is a contributor to Alive to This, as well as Annalise Jacimides. Thank you both for joining us, and please feel welcome. Anyone who has joined us, including Carl and Annalise, if you have anything that you would like to ask or contribute, by all means, you can type a message in the chat or, okay, Robert, if they turn on their video.
Absolutely.
Wave.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. So welcome, and thank you for joining us. Emma is going to start us off this evening with a poem from her recent book, Hermitage. And Emma, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself so listeners are more familiar with who you are and your writing, and then start us off.
Yeah, I'm Emma Krosschell. I just published Hermitage, my first poetry collection with Littoral Books this fall. And yeah, it's been wonderful to work with Littoral Books. So I'm happy to be here with you guys. And also, I just love the idea of Alive to This. So I'm just excited to be engaging with this. I think it's such a great topic for an essay collection. And I think it's also really no small feat to like engage with this type of topic through nonfiction. So props to you all. Um, so Hermitage was written when during a year that my partner and I were living off the grid on an island off the coast, and then we did have to leave in the winter, unfortunately, and went to the mountains of Vermont. And in so many ways, this collection really is about this idea of aliveness that and living fully that you all wrote about. And there's in the book there's just a ton of tension between the feeling of feeling fully alive and then this feeling of half life, half alive, and how much pain there is there. And living on this island, it wasn't sort of an intentional thing to sort of dive into life this way, but it sort of became really impossible often to ignore this fullness of life. Like there wasn't anyone else there. There's no other humans. All there is animals, plants, the weather, and that experience of half life just didn't feel very relevant living in that way. But here I was still a human, still sort of living in my head those ways. So the poem I sort of wanted to start us off with when I was thinking about what to read, I just couldn't ignore the storm today that we're experiencing on the coast in Maine. So living on the island and just living on the coast of Maine, the windstorms were definitely a time of really intense aliveness. Just very, very scary, very powerful. And it's just something that always spoke to me and it always just made me want to write poems. Um, and I think like the thing I sort of wanted to highlight about that was that I feel like aliveness so often lives so close to fear. And today, as I sort of started hearing the wind picking up, I was feeling this old fear sort of stirring in me and remembering that that fear does live next to the aliveness and that the fear is sort of a trailhead towards it. So with that sort of introduction, um, this poem is called Storm Fear. The wind gnaws at my mind rather than my skin, which is untouched as the window screens rattle and joists creak. It insists I pay attention, stop going about my day, stop saying I live here in this brain alone. The wind ghosts laugh in their wild flinging branches, their spattering sea spray, and wait and gently erode each bar I erected, each thought I sculpted, to guard me from belonging in this soft, smooth nest of atmosphere. And that's it.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful reading and appropriate reading on this stormy night, as you said. I have a process question for you. And you talked a little bit about state of mind, and I think that plays into process, at least it does for me. But I wonder, as you're writing, do you have an idea of what you want to write about when you start? And then how often do you achieve just that thing? Or does your process shift your goals? And is what you end up with different from what you think you were going to have?
Mm. Interesting. I think I would say I don't usually have an idea of where I'm going. Um, Usually, how poems come to me are I sort of get a sense of something, usually outside or inside of myself, that is sort of knocking at the door a little bit. And then I know that there's a poem to write if I have a first line in my head. So if I don't have a first line, if I sort of have an idea of a poem, but the first line isn't there, then I don't feel that a poem will come of it. And then if there is a first line or a first couple lines, then I feel that a poem will come out. And I basically do not feel like I know where it's going. So, very different from like your essay writing, all of you, which again, I'm just like very impressed for being able to have that sort of thread that continues through that in a short poem, especially, is not quite as, composed.
Maybe it can even be harder to write very short things than things where you have a little more freedom with your words.
True.
Thank you. So we're going to shift to hear from our essayists who contributed to Alive to this. And before we begin the readings, I wonder if each author could also share a little bit about their process. All of the essays reflected here with our authors today, they were about journeys. And I don't know, I think writing is a journey. And so I wonder for you, how many edits did you go through to get to this version that you wanted to submit for this book? And then also the same thing, when you wrote it, did you know what you wanted to say, or did your process shape your message? And I'd like all of you to answer, and if it's okay, Robert, I'd like to start with you.
Wow. Um, I would say, okay, I had the kernel of this essay already written, and it had been published on a blog in a very, very condensed form. And it essentially described my process of discernment before attending the seminary. And when I was very dissatisfied with that result, because so much of what I went through had to be truncated because of a certain amount of language that I could use, or a certain number of words. And so this was like sort of like opening a floodgate for me, and I could actually put more of that process in. And I think I packed a lot in there. Probably more. Looking back, I might edit some out. I might edit some of it out. I might streamline some language, but it really was sort of like this revisiting of the concept and then reconcepting it and making it more accurate to the experience.
Thank you. And JJ, do you want to share a bit about your process? How many edits did you go through, and how do things go? Do you end up where you think you're going to end up when you're writing?
Yeah, I think I started with a much broader idea, a much more expansive kind of concept. And what I ended up writing was just a small piece of that. And I think the way I think about it is that I felt like I ended up sort of choosing to write from the wound, like from that part of me that was unresolved and hurting. And I just let that emotion kind of carry me through the piece. So I had a first line in mind or set of lines, but I wasn't quite sure where I was going. So I let my heart lead out and let that emotion just flow through as I wrote. So I was laughing and crying as I was writing the piece until the last word. And then I was like, okay. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you. It's a really powerful idea, writing from the wound. So thank you for sharing that. And Dave, I wonder if you could also share.
Yeah, I usually start for this essay was a lot similar to how I start a lot of my pieces. It's usually just some image. I usually write fiction, and it's usually some image. It's usually based on something I lived through, and I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, and it just grips me, and it won't let me go. And I just have to like sit down and start from that image. I found I no longer write outlines because every time I write outlines and I try to follow them, I'm like forcing myself through this process and trying to like control the piece of writing, and I feel like it's bigger than me, and I have to just let it go, which means I have to edit a lot. I go through multiple drafts to kind of like figure out like what did I do, and find those threads after. But if I follow an outline too closely, my prose get really wooden. They just get very just predictable, and I don't even like them. So I like to just make a mess and then then it's on the back end, do so much work.
Well, and thank you all for sharing. I'm really curious about everybody's process. When I start writing, I usually find that I didn't realize what I was writing about until I get to the end. So thank you for sharing. Kara.
Similar. Oftentimes I write from an experience, and I'll have sort of if I think about it too much, it does become limiting. Like Dave said, and I have this experience as I also am a yoga and meditation teacher. And I remember as a new teacher years ago, teaching from notes. And when the day came that I just taught and put the notes aside, I felt like, oh, now I know how to do what I can do. And if I try to teach, like if I do a particular workshop or I teach something very specific and I have to rely on notes, it feels very rote to me. It feels too formulaic. And I find the same experience with writing. So I can really relate to this idea of, yeah, lead from where the trouble is sometimes. Like JJ said, I wrote from the wound. I had the immense privilege of seeing early drafts of JJ's essay, and I feel like when she turned toward that, what came out was just so brilliant. And I think there is that part in each of us that we kind of struggle with. Do I speak from this? Can this be public? Can this be in the world? But when we do it, and we, to some extent put away the outline, sometimes those outlines come in as useful here and there. But when we are like fully ourselves, even if it's only one aspect of ourselves, there's such an aliveness to that writing just creates this aliveness. So I can relate to a lot of what the other essayists are saying. And yeah, sometimes where I end up is not where I started, and often really other people poking me really helps. Erin poked me with some of my essays. And it was helpful. It was helpful. She said, yeah, don't go over there. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
You're right. Nobody does it all alone. And if you end up with a product that's really authentic, it'll move people. And that's the point, right?
Absolutely. Are we ready to read?
I think
All
so.
right. So we're going to start with Dave's essay. Dave Patterson, if you would give us a little bit of background about yourself, introduce yourself to the listeners, and then Dave will read a section from his essay in Alive to This.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This is such a beautiful anthology. I feel like ever since I've gotten my copy this fall, I just keep holding it and looking through at it. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. And I'm so honored to be included in it. Just for a quick bio, I'm a novelist. My novel, Soon the Light Will Be Perfect, came out in 2019. So I mostly write fiction. And I'll just announce here, I think that next fall I have a book of short stories that's being published by Littoral, and I'm very excited about that. And I mean, I'm just in awe of what Agnes and Jim have done over all these decades. So, in addition to being a fiction writer, I'm also an educator. I teach at high school English at Gorham High School, and I was a beer columnist for the Portland Press Herald for years. I wrote 200 articles about the beautiful beer made in Maine. So I've written a lot of fiction and nonfiction, but this piece that I wrote for this anthology, it comes from a place, it kind of like a heavy thing that happened during the pandemic. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. The idea of this essay had been rolling around my head. And I saw the call for submissions in the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance weekly email. And I thought this would be the perfect place to finally write this essay. And just a quick background on it, and then I'm just going to read from the start. It was something heavy that had happened in my family. And, I kind of avoided writing it for a long time. But like I said earlier, the things that I need to write just won't let me go. And really, they won't let me go until I write them out. And this was such an amazing way. I knew I could keep it short. It was an anthology. So I was like, all right, it can be a short essay and I can get in there and kind of figure out how I felt about what happened. And so I'll just read the first 4 minutes from this essay. It's called The Light is Getting Brighter. Frostbite nipped at the tip of my nose. It was 10 degrees, getting colder now that the sun had set. The steel cable above us groaned as it carried our bodies up the mountain. My brother sat on the other edge of the chairlift. We didn't talk. There weren't words yet for what he was going through. It had been less than a week. The ambulance, the emergency room, the helicopter airlift to a bigger hospital. His wife was still on life support. Doctors weren't sure when she'd wake from her coma. I suggested skiing, our winter ritual, to give him a break from his hospital vigil. Riding up the lift, I wasn't sure if it had been a good idea. I tried not to think about the sound of beeping hospital machines as trail lights clicked on for night skiing. I shifted on my side of the chairlift, understanding that even if there were words for what he was going through, for what our family was going through, we might not have access to them. Ours is a multi-generational Northern New England family in the puritanical sense, in the shove emotions that come to the surface as deep down in your body as you're able to sense. When Tom and I were kids, our mother had stomach cancer. There were surgeries, chemo, radiation, then remission. For over a year, my mother was in and out of the hospital. We never really talked about it. She survived, but the words sat in our bodies unsaid. When our father lost his job for a year and a half and we plummeted into the lower middle class, welfare, food pantry deliveries, cash gifts from family friends, the words again went unspoken. As the chairlift reached the peak, it struck me that our bodies are filled with words tamped deep into our marrow. How could we begin to talk now? Which way do you want to go? I asked when we reached the summit. Tom studied the cloudless night sky. A few stars pocked the darkness that sat heavy above us. Out in the distance, the Route 302 causeway cut through Moose Pond. Car headlights tunneled their way through the night. The hills beyond were dotted with house lights. Jack sprat down to the head wall, he said. He ratcheted his snowboard boot into his binding and started down the trail. Our edges rasped over packed powder, a welcome sound against the silence that waited for us on the lift. Pleasant Mountain ski area was still called Shawnee Peak back then. It's a modest mountain, a scrappy little brother to the larger ski resorts in the Northeast. With its slow chairlifts, abbreviated terrain, and one lone peak, It's an underdog. Tom and I love it all the more for these reasons. It reminds us of our ragged, wonderful childhood near the Canadian border. It's the ranch-style house we grew up in, squat, cozy, open-armed. Tom noticed the light first. Back on the lift, in our silence, he turned in the chair to survey the dark valley beyond the mountain. "What is that?" he asked. When I turned, the horizon glowed with a white light. "Maybe it's Portland," I said, glad to talk, though I knew the city lights were too far off to cast such luminescence. "Looks more like a UFO. Maybe it's the mothership coming to take us home," I joked, like the Parliament record. We laughed until the cold air made us cough. I wiggled my fingers in my mittens for warmth. As the chairlift turned towards the summit, we turned from time to time to consider this startling light. At the peak, we studied the trail map. There aren't a lot of trail options at night on Pleasant Mountain, but Tom and I like to pretend. Beyond the ski mountain summit, higher ledges rise into the dark sky. Anna and I used to hike those ledges every summer before we had kids. Once, Anna spotted mica crystals along the trail. When my eyes adjusted to the light glinting off the mineral flakes, the entire mountain floor began to glow. My bloodstream tuned to this golden pitch of light, as if the mountain was a mystical place. Perhaps all mountains are. Maybe even all of existence on our tiny blue marble floating through darkness, where people we love sometimes need life support to stay alive.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Kara, can I just jump in? Dave, you have one of my favorite phrases, one of my favorite phrases in the whole book, I think. And the audience doesn't get to hear it because it's the last line. And so I'm going to indulge the thing I enjoy, and I'm going to read it. He wrote, "These aren't the words inside our bodies finally coming out, but they kept our tongues fed." I just love that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Dave, I'm going to start with a question. So there's a way in which people tend to reach for each other in the face of tragedy or adversity, which your essay really portrays so well, even if it's in a very quiet way. You're not directly talking about what's happening, but clearly there are bridges being built between you and your brother here. How did you experience the power of connection as a bridge to feeling more present or more fully alive, even if it was in this quieter and more serious way?
Yeah, I feel like one of the things when I thought about this essay and the call submissions you guys had about feeling alive in Maine, I thought about like, where do I feel most alive? And it's on a mountain. It's either hiking or it's skiing, or it just feels so connected. And that, like I remember this memory of skiing with my brother as we were kind of in the midst of this tragedy we were dealing with. And I realized that was the connective tissue, was like the land, that it is healing and it is the thing. I'm kind of obsessed in my work with, I have 3 brothers and I don't have any sisters. And I kind of have a lifeline obsession with this, like the way men are allowed to love other men and the way that men are allowed to talk to other men and that we love. And there isn't a language, there's often not a vocabulary for it. And so that vocabulary for me has often been through action, through doing things together. And so when you can't talk, when our tongues are dying to be fed, but they can't be because of whatever cultural restraints men have around being intimate with each other, it's like that action in place.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that.
We have a question in the chat. Kara, do we have a second for Dave?
We do, absolutely. The question in the chat is comes from Carl. Do you want to read it, Erin?
No, go ahead.
He's asking about the reference to the Parliament record.
Oh, it's the Parliament Funkadelic, the mothership connection. So that if you definitely check out that cover, it definitely, I remember for the first time I saw it, it was like, oh, aliens do exist. George Clinton is one. So it's this idea of like that my brother and I, we listened to a lot of funk music and 90s hip hop, which sampled a lot from the Parliament record. And so that's where that came from.
That's great. Thank you.
So now we're going to turn to JJ Bolton and have her introduce herself, and she's going to read from her spectacular essay, Enter the Saw.
Hello. Thanks for having me here on this stormy night. Trying to think how I want to introduce myself. Yes, so I'm JJ Bolton, and I'm also known as Jenny, so you'll sometimes hear both. But my background is in English education and also in social work. But I sat for my social work licensing exam when I was 9 months pregnant with my oldest daughter. So I've been a stay-at-home mom for the last 15 years. And this is kind of my first foray into writing and my first time ever being published. So this is kind of all new to me. Yeah, very exciting. And the piece I wrote is called Enter the Saw. And it's basically about, I say, combating chronic illness with a chainsaw, or maybe really the despair brought on by chronic illness with a chainsaw. And the part I'm going to read for you is actually in the latter half, and it's kind of focuses on the saw's importance to me, and sort of what it afforded me, and helped in my healing process. So, okay, so here goes. Enter the saw. The saw was indeed going to afford me the skill set that I desired, but I was also in search of a feeling. When I'm holding a saw, I'm still afraid. The saw doesn't change that about me. There's no way around the fact that my flesh is no match for that rotating chain, and I'm acutely aware that I could make a fatal mistake, or at least a fairly gruesome one, requiring immediate medical attention. But it's also difficult to deny that wielding a loud, vibrating 18-inch steel bar with rotating teeth doesn't give you a feeling of raw power. No, the phallic imagery isn't lost on me. To further extend the metaphor, we were instructed to start the saw by positioning it between our thighs. Freud would have a field day, I know. But for someone like me who no longer had control over a basic bodily function like elimination, the saw made me feel alive. One specialist I saw while seeking treatment offered me what she thought was the good news that my ailments would not shorten my lifespan. They were not, she assured me, life-threatening. I realized in that moment that long life didn't feel like a blessing in my current state, and rather reinforced the fear that my suffering would be permanent, escaped only by death that was unlikely to happen anytime soon. And what does life-threatening mean anyway? She meant my body would not die from it, of course. That's true. But I had fallen into a deep well of chronic pain, isolation, and despair. There's a kind of death in that. I was desperate to feel something other than defeated. They say that the mood of those who are considering suicide often improves right before they do it because they have a plan of escape. They feel in control, and they know what they are going to do. Those around them often mistake this change in mood for improvement, but in reality, it's just the power of self-determination and certainty. I felt I needed a plan to live or a plan to die. It was time to decide. I realized that wielding a chainsaw can be seen as a sort of death wish, but dying that way doesn't tempt me. Still, if I'm honest, there's a sort of appeal to occasionally being death adjacent and having that option to once again choose life. Because that's what I wanted, really. I wanted the power to live again. I wanted to stop spending hours on the toilet. I wanted to stop fixating on the myriad of steps it would take for me to make it through each day. I wanted to take some risks, live a little louder, and for a few moments, feel like I wasn't at the mercy of some unseen enemy that had taken over my body's ability to self-regulate. So I did it. I signed up and showed up with stiff orange chaps, a saw that I didn't know how to use, and a noticeably nervous grin. I knew this wouldn't fix everything. I wasn't going to wake up tomorrow problem-free, shitting like a superhero. But sometimes a mental shift is almost as important as a physical one. And I was ready. I was ready to try living again.
I love that. Thank you. What is your relationship to your saw now, Jenny?
I call my saw Ethel. So basically because, well, it's actually after a character from a play, but it's to make my saw seem less dangerous and scary to me. I'm still really scared of my saw. I don't know if that will ever change. The woman who taught me, Tish Carr, actually said she's an arborist and she's been doing this for, tons of years. And she says when she starts up her saw, even now, she's a little nervous. And I think for someone like me who's generally somewhat anxiety ridden, I expect that to be part of my just way of being with the saw. But I think maybe coupled with that is that feeling of competence and feeling that this is something I can do that I really didn't necessarily think I could do before attempting it. And so, yeah, that aspect of it fills me with a little bit of a sense of power, just like a little bit,
That makes me think of what Emma said earlier on about how fear is like a trailhead that leads toward aliveness.
Mhm.
There's some real truth in that. Will
Mhm.
you come clear me out if I have a tree fall on my yard today?
Sure, if it's within my skill set, I'd be happy to help.
JJ,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would love to know what made you decide to submit an essay for this anthology. You're talking about, you were writing from a wound. It's really vulnerable. You're someone with anxiety. Putting your writing out for people is really brave. It's brave for everybody. And I don't know, I think what you wrote is incredible, and that you did it is inspiring. And I just wonder what made you decide to do it.
I think initially, well, I loved the concept of aliveness, and I was also intimidated by it because I was thinking of it primarily in the positive sense initially, like, enthusiasm and feeling awake and, in really happy, wonderful ways, which I do experience too, but I wasn't feeling that way at the time. But I realized that I was very present with my pain at the time, and that part of being alive isn't just, enthusiasm and positivity, but is also being present with negativity and pain and despair and anger and all those things too. So I guess I don't know exactly what made me write it. I think I just felt like maybe that angle needed to be heard too. And if not embraced, at least sort of dealt with in some way. So I think I ultimately just felt like, well, I have something to contribute as well, even if it maybe looks a little different. And as it turned out, a lot of writers wrote about loss and death and illness and all kinds of things. So I wasn't alone in that dichotomy, but I think I just wanted to make sure it was there.
Thank you. Kara, were you about to ask a question and I cut you off?
No, I wasn't. I was actually about to say, does anyone else have questions for Jenny?
Oh, good, Dave.
Yeah, I love this essay. It's so vulnerable, and after reading your essay, I was like, oh, maybe I didn't go far enough in mine. Like, I feel like it's hard not to put on masks and use language to kind of like protect ourselves and our vulnerability. I didn't know if you could talk about like, is this something that you feel like you're at now with as a writer? So, I mean, it's so vulnerable, and I loved it so much. I've read it multiple times. Is it something that you've like grown into now as a writer and as someone who's willing to like go this far, or could you have written this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as far as like putting yourself out there like that? And again, just bravo. I love this essay.
Thank you. I think I've always valued honesty in my writing as far as I could take it, but I actually think if I stretch myself to think of the woundedness as a gift, I'd say that kind of pushed me um, into that place of being even more so brutally honest. Like, I think I just decided that I needed to lean into that. And the exposure is uncomfortable. Like, I feel like I've had a little recoil since, like, oh my gosh, did I actually say that? You know, I didn't really write it to be read out loud, and twice now I've been reading it out loud. So it is scary, but I think it's worth it. And I feel like deep down, other people must feel these things, and whether or not they feel comfortable saying them. So I kind of felt like somebody's got to say it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other questions for Jenny before we move on? Okay. So I'm sure you've noticed that Robert Diamante has given over his MC job so that he can take on the role of author and read his really wonderful essay that he contributed to Alive to this called All the Gods, Any Gods.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Cara, for taking over tonight. I'm going to try to read from the book, although I actually I have it up on my screen, which might be a little easier for me to read because my eyes don't really function as well as they used to, even with glasses. So I'm going to go ahead and try to read from my screen. And I'll be reading, I guess, a small section, and then I'm going to sort of skip over a section and then go back to the reading. So India was a place of contradictions. It hid nothing. One moment could be a mystical revelation where all my senses lit up. In the next, the most shattering corporeal horror could occur, testing my ability to stay open. The cycle was endless. But what astonished me most was the pervasiveness of the religion. I knew nothing about Hinduism other than what I had been witnessing. I romanticized it, found it fascinating and moving. I visited temples, ceremonial spaces to honor all manifestations of Brahma, neither gilded nor vaulted, and hardly magnanimous. These sacred places were patinaed by soot, festooned with garlands of orange marigolds, spiced with the pungent fog of Nag Champa. Some temples were no larger than a niche, wedged between two shops along a cow path. Some harbored hordes of rats. They were spectacular. I vowed to learn more. On my last morning in Varanasi, I had another epiphany. While sitting on the ghats near my hotel, I watched the morning puja. The poignancy of the ritual stirred me. It was such a meditative act of devotion, a connection to the divine. I wanted to pray so much, but I had abandoned my own God years ago. And yet that morning, while watching devotees pray, I had such a strong response. The old woman stepped down from the ghat into the Ganges, and her purple sari transformed into liquid color, bubbling around her slight body in the muddy water. Cupping her thin fingers, she scooped handfuls of the Ganges over her head and let it spill around her and melt back into the water. She did this several times in procession. Then she took the small brass kamandalu that had been tied to her waist and dipped it into the river. The shiny container reflected the rising orange sun in such a way that it appeared as if she were holding fire when she raised her arms. Then suddenly she was still. A slow breeze crept down the ghat and blew open the folds of her sari. The fabric billowed around her head, and the gilded edges lit up. She was encircled within a corona of fantastic color. Witnessing beauty can sometimes feel like heartbreak and longing, devoid of any cloying sentiment. Such devotion as I was witnessing felt exquisite, and I had ached for a similar communion with the divine. I had been on a path toward deep-rooted cynical disbelief. My anger already a stance, a position. But how do you rectify the oceanic experience of connectiveness without accepting the transcendental as an essential component? A special problem arises for beauty once the realm of the sacred is no longer believed in, according to Elaine Scarry in her book. My second epiphany in India followed this observation. If I could be inspired by and patient with the unfamiliar gods of my neighbors, why could I not be the same way with my own? My problems with Christianity were completely justified. I had been on the receiving end of very bad behavior by those who practiced it. And though not easily dismissed, their behaviors did not account for the entirety of the religion, the whole story. I had to admit I knew as much about the real stories, the theology, as I did about Hinduism. How could I despise what I did not understand?
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Sorry for my lost voice there. Robert's essay kind of goes through, of all of the essays, it might touch on the most continents, I believe. There's a lot of travel
A
happening.
little epic.
Yeah, there's this inner travel, and then there's physically placing his body in different places. I do see many examples in our culture of people seeking spirituality, but turning away from organized religion. And it almost, in some ways, it's very palpable that we are reaching for something, but we don't always know what to reach for or how to access what we're seeking. Your essay explores early exposure to religion and a discontentment with that. And yet you're also engaging with the world through this spiritual lens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of the kind of obstacle that brings you hard up against something inside of yourself that you can't deny and you can't turn away from, you can't ignore it. And so you have to enter through a different door into whatever comes next, which is really the whole process of discernment that you're describing in your essay. How has this changed your relationship to yourself?
Oh, definitely brought me closer to my, personal beliefs and my convictions. Certainly, the punchline is, the decision of whether or not I will actually go to seminary. I never say I actually do, but I end up going through seminary, and it was a 10-year process and very intense process, very quiet process. Very few people knew I was doing it, and that I have a master's degree in theology, which it's just kind of like, for some people who know me really well, that it makes total sense because of all of the questions that I've asked all of my life. And for other people, it's kind of a it seems a little bit discordant because of what I do, like, for a living. I mean, so I would say that it's a very quiet experience of getting closer to myself and knowing what my existential needs are. That's probably the best way to put it.
Has it changed the way you construct interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, totally. I don't go after people anymore. I mean, I used to be very combative when I was younger about religion, especially, growing up gay in an Italian American, very macho culture. I mean, I'm a New Jersey Italian with 2 older brothers and, lots of uncles. And so growing up gay in that culture, sort of puts you on the periphery to begin with, and you become very combative. One can become combative or very quiet. I've never really been a quiet person. This has made me sort of quiet and more contemplative going through this experience, because whereas before I was on the attack, which is why I went to seminary, is to sort of learn the language to attack through theology and attack the aggressors, by understanding what their ammunition is or was, still is. This has completely leveled that in my mind. It's like, don't take that on. It sort of rested in me, all of that acrimony, and just sort of brought me closer to what my own beliefs are. And it was sort of easy for me after a couple classes and a few exegeses of writing about, you know, what the arguments were or are against gay people, for instance. It became secondary, it became tertiary to the other learnings that were going on during that. It didn't make me any more Christian, but it made me understand where people are coming from. And I have some very, very close friends who are born again Christians, you know, and stuff like that. So the short answer is it made me a nicer person, I think. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts or questions for Robert? Yeah,
Great.
Jenny.
Robert, I just wanted to, well, it's kind of a comment and a question, I guess. I really liked in your piece how Kara touched on it a little bit, but how you were moving between, I think, at least 3 different locations, and also moving in time as well, like the distant past, the near past, and then the present, at least when the piece was written, kind of present. And as a reader, it sort of gave me a certain sense of destabilization, like, wait, where am I? And what time is it? And which country am I in? And it felt like it sort of mirrored your discernment process of uncertainty and trying to figure out, you know, where you were going and why. And I just wondered if that was intentional at all, because I really like it when form and content match up that way. And I didn't know if that was something you intended or just sort of happened organically as you were writing.
I was very aware that I was bookending the chaotic experience in between, you know, the 2 moments of like the way it starts out. I mean, for the audience that hasn't read it, I start out, you know, in Austria contemplating whether or not I should be going to seminary, and then I end in the same place. So those are the 2 moments. That is the one moment in time that I split and then put in the madness that was in my mind, you know, the going through I'm in India, and then I'm in here, and then I'm there, and you know, people are calling me, you know, this and that throughout my life, and you know, I'm feeling this horrible oppression. What does all of this mean? So yeah, there was like this I still to this day I think, God, what could I have left out? Because it was such a sort of a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts. But I think everything needed to be in there in order to arrive at, you know, those 2, that final moment. If that makes any sense. I loved your essay, by the way, too. I love both of your essays, Dave and JJ, for very different reasons. The moment when the moon breaches the horizon, if anybody has ever witnessed that or experienced that, you know that anticipation, you think you know what's coming, you have no idea if it's the mothership or if it's the harvest moon rising over like Peaks Island at a certain time of year. It's just like this amazing experience. And I love your litany in the beginning, your steps, like do this, do that, the Tampax and everything. It was really funny. You have a great sense of humor.
Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We are kind of winding down in our program. We have about 8 more minutes to go. So I would love to turn back toward Emma. Emma, if you would share another piece from your book. And again, Emma's book is called Hermitage. It came out this fall from Littoral Books. And you can find copies of it there. I'm sure there are copies also at most of the bookstores that Littoral Books sells books through, like Gulf of Maine Books and several stores down in Portland. Emma, if you would read one closing piece for us, and then Erin and I will turn the hosting back over to Robert for the very end.
So I figured since I'm closing out that I'd read the last poem in the collection. And this poem sort of represents for me I was thinking about how to describe it, like a moving from sort of a what to a how in life. Instead of focusing on things that we're doing or like content or place or whatever, recognizing that there's a how to this idea of living fully that we can experience at any moment. So, with that sort of preamble, this poem is called Spruce Woods. Beginning in the middle of a small patch of trees, a few acres of spruce, whose lost cones frosted in old sap and the millions of needles make a brown and sticky carpet, and the giants stand silent and the same. That is when the path through the trees offers itself up, as if it knows you are nothing more than you are, and certainly nothing less. As if it would lead you, all brown and sticky, through what had always before been draped in sameness, to nothing magical at the end. The path is what was magic.
Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, thank you. That is extraordinary. Thank you.
Mhm. Robert, I think this is where we turn it back over to you. Is that true?
I don't know if I could do any better than the two of you have done tonight, and I just want to thank you very much. It was a lot of fun to hand it over.
You.
I think now would be a good time to ask the Bouchels to come on and say a few words like Agnes usually does. Agnes, if you're out there,
Yeah, I am out there. Can you see me?
we can.
Good.
We can see part of Jim too.
Can you see Jim
Here too.
This was a great show, everybody. It was really, really good. Very interesting, exciting. I loved hearing everyone read. And we're looking forward to another in January. Is that right? Another Literally Alive. Literally
Yep.
Alive goes on and on. So thank you, everybody. And January 23rd, Portland writers will be appearing at Mechanics Hall. And there's another in Searsport, is there not, at the Anodyne Bookstore in January?
The reading?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. We'll be doing a reading. We'll put this on the website just to remind people. Carl Little, Annalise Jacimides, myself, and Cara, I believe. Erin, I don't know if you're going to be joining us, but we'll be reading at the Anodyne Bookstore, the new location in Searsport, just outside of town. So join us there if you're in the Mid-Coast area.
And join us in Portland if you're in the Portland area on January 23rd
At Mechanics Hall.
at Mechanics Hall. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that you do have that that coupon code ALIVE, ALIVE, all lowercase, for free shipping now through Sunday, and it's only available to us here. And or tell your friends. And thank you very much. This will be online within a couple days.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.